The fourth is entitled, Is Japanese Really Uniquely Unique? It features Elenora Jorden, professor of linguistics at Cornell University.
I understand that there has been a growing interest in the acquisition of Japanese, not only among the literati, as in the past in the United States, but also increasingly among businessmen, among prospective or active lawyers, diplomats, and people from different walks of life. It is certainly heartening for us to realize that, and of course you have contributed very importantly to this trend. Now, is it really true that the number of Americans expressing sufficient interest in the acquisition of Japanese has been on the very noticeable rise, say during the last 10 years or so?
I don't know the most recent figures. I don't think any really recent figures have been compiled, but just a few years ago, when the Modern Language Association collected statistics, Japanese was second in the country among the less commonly, the so-called less commonly taught languages. It was second only to Hebrew. It was ahead of Chinese, surprisingly. Yes. Now, since that time, we've recognized mainland China, and there are a number of students who are beginning to study Chinese now. There's a sudden increase in interest. When this levels off, I don't know, where we'll be. But certainly, in terms of our own program, we are having more and more applicants.
At Cornell, that is.
At Cornell, right. And I think part of this has to do with the fact that we are interested not only in preparing people for literature, but also for other fields.
Would you say that the level of sophistication on the part of the American businessman, not only in regard to the Japanese language, but in things Japanese as a whole, is on the increase?
I think that there is more willingness on the part of younger people to admit that this kind of knowledge is crucial. I think in times gone by, there was a feeling that you could go anywhere in the world and do business, and people are beginning to realize the importance of the foreign culture, the foreign language, the foreign attitudes, and that you just can't operate unless there's mutual understanding, both sides.
There are some people, some scholars, professional linguists and students of the Japanese language who tend to regard Japanese as being very esoteric, something very special, which rejects any attempt at objective analysis. In other words, they tend to associate some kind of mysticism, or mystique, I might put it that way, with the Japanese language. Now, what is your view on that?
Well, I think that one thing that people tend to forget is that a teacher of a language is already socialized in his own culture. And when he walks into the classroom, he already has one point of view, which comes from his own culture. And included within that socialization is a matter of attitude toward language. I think just the way Japanese regard language in general is totally different from the way that an American regards language. And so the Japanese always express great amazement if any foreigner can speak anything in Japanese at all. And they also are amazed if you analyze Japanese in very objective terms. But Japanese is unique, yes, but so is English, and so is French, and so is German. And I think that the Japanese are unique in being the only people I know who think that their own language is uniquely unique.
Well put, beautifully put. Well, frankly, I tend to subscribe to the notion that the Japanese language, there is some uniqueness,
Definitely.
Uh-huh.
As in English.
Well, as in English, yes, true.
They're in different areas, different areas. But we can find our uniqueness, and Japanese can find theirs, and so on.
So, may I construe from your statement that you regard Japanese as being sufficiently universal and therefore teachable to those who are not born and raised in Japan?
That's right, that's right. But I also believe that it should be approached in a certain way. And I subscribe very strongly to the team teaching approach.
Would you describe what it
That
is
is,
all about?
I think that to teach any foreign language effectively, you need two kinds of teachers.
I see.
One must be a native of the target language and target culture.
True.
He must be an absolutely perfect example of the target. And the other teacher should be an absolutely perfect example of the base language and culture. By base, I mean what the students are coming from. Because if there's one thing, if we're talking about Japanese now, the acquisition of Japanese, if there's one thing that a native Japanese can never be, never, it's a gaijin. And he can be a foreigner in America, but he can't be, but we don't call it foreigners in America gaijin. You need a gaijin in the classroom if the gaijin is going to study Japanese. But you must have a native speaker, of course. And the two must work together. It's not a competition between the two. It's a team approach.
And that's what you practice at Cornell.
Right.
How many native Japanese teachers or instructors do you have?
We have about 7 or 8.
What about
American?
Yes,
American?
Japanese American teachers.
Yeah. We have we have 3 at the moment, and a couple of assistants, graduate students.
Are all of them professional linguists or linguisticians?
Yes.
I might put it that way.
The native Japanese, some of them are studying linguistics now, getting graduate degrees in linguistics. But they serve as the model of the
Both
Japanese
language
culture.
and culture.
That's right. Because we also put heavy emphasis on gestures, reactions, hesitation noises. We teach students how to say eto and ano and so on.
As Prime Minister Ohira is credited with.
Right. We also teach aizuchi as part of our course. And these are all things that are special to Japan.
Would you advise that a similar approach be adopted by the English teaching community here in Japan?
Definitely. And there must be more emphasis in Japan placed on the spoken language, spoken English. There, again, this is cultural, but there is a tendency toward being contemptuous of spoken as opposed to written in Japan.
What kind of grades would you give to English teaching here in Japan, at least on the secondary school level or on the collegiate level?
I'm a little reluctant to say this because I'm sure that there are people in this country who are doing a very good job, and I don't want to appear to be criticizing them, but in general, there is just too much stress on reading and translation, and no language is a translation of another. You cannot get at English by translating Japanese. You cannot get at Japanese by translating from English. And until people are able to read in the foreign language and discuss it in the foreign language, they're really not coping. Since there is almost no stress in this country, in general, placed on the spoken language, there tends to be very little stress on it. The students, of course, cannot discuss what they're reading in English. But all they can do is look at the symbols and translate into Japanese, and all their discussion is in Japanese. And I think they miss a great deal. Yes.
Would you say, though, that the level of English language teaching in Japan has seen some major improvements, say, during the last decade or so?
I think one thing that's happened is that there are so many foreigners here now, there are so many gaijin, that the Japanese are becoming more aware of the fact that in spite of 6-8 years of study, that they really are very afraid of approaching a foreigner and talking. They feel that they're not prepared for it. So through that realization and through more contact between Japanese and Americans, this is breaking down to some extent, but it's very slow.
We, I think, are more keenly aware of the fact that English, after all, is not a dead language as in the case of Latin or ancient Greek, for instance.
Exactly, exactly. It's changing every day, as is Japanese. So it's much more of a challenge to keep up with the current language than it is the old literary language. You can count on that to stay the same.
Would you make any additional comments on the state of affairs of English language teaching here in this country?
Well, I think, again, that the Japanese orientation is very much toward words, isolated words. I'm always impressed by the fact that if you ask a Japanese, even one who has no confidence even to ask where the railroad station is, if you ask him, what's the Japanese word for biodegradable, or what's the word for nuclear power plant, he can give it to you right away. But he can't put that word into any kind of sentence, and he can't ask the most simple questions or answer simple questions. But he has learned all these words. And I think this is a very dangerous approach, because there are very few words in Japanese that are exactly equivalent to the English words, and vice versa. Now, you also forget just the cultural connotations of words. For example, even if you know that the Japanese word for telephone book is denwacho, the American reaction to telephone book and the Japanese reaction to telephone book, entirely different.
How true.
The telephone book is something we use every day. A child can use it. It's in every, it accompanies every public phone. Here, I'm surrounded by public phones. I've never seen a telephone book with any one of them. So culturally, they're different. Now, if you move up to sentences, if you move up to discourse, the two cultures are very, very different. And this is why I'm very both interested and upset by the fact that these little calculators, gadgets, which go from one word in Japanese to one word in English, didn't sell at all in the States.
No.
But here, they're selling like wildfire, because, again, they support the Japanese contention that all you need to know is lots and lots of vocabulary.
But on the other hand, you once said something to the effect that when you talk to a Japanese adult with some command of English, you know, he tends to strike you as being a little bit childish. Now, what
The conversation,
did you mean by that?
Yeah, I don't mean that the person was childish. I mean that the tendency, again, is to stay within a very fixed area of conversation with
when did
foreigners.
you come to Japan?
Right.
Do you like
right.
sashimi?
Yeah, right. And a lot of this has to do with how you talk to a stranger. In other words, our topics of small talk are different in the two cultures. And this is something that should be included in every language course. It isn't just how do you say X, it's what do you say? Who says what, to whom, where, when, and how. And this is what I mean.
5 W's and 1 H or something like that, right?
That's right. And not enough attention is paid to that.
I see.
So that it's not the people that seem childish, but the level of conversation, simply because the topics that are thought to be appropriate for speaking to foreigners have not been investigated sufficiently.
I think this is an area in which sociolinguistics or linguistic anthropology could do a little bit more.
Right.
The final topic I would like to touch on is the fact that English itself is very rapidly changing, and sometimes we find ourselves at a loss, not knowing how to cope with these tremendous changes that do take place in business English, for instance, jargon and argot and things of that sort, euphemisms and circumlocutions and all that sort of thing. Now, would you care to comment on some of these aspects of changing English?
Well, if the Japanese will just remember what they're doing with Gairango, they can't complain about the fact that we introduce a few new words.
So you get even with us. Huh?
That's right, that's right. But I think the important thing, again, if they have the appropriate framework, if they have the appropriate cultural framework, if they know how to operate in American society, the least of the problems is vocabulary, what those calculators are worrying about. That's the least of the problem. And I wish that there could be, for the Japanese, some kinds of advanced training programs in the States. Advanced in the sense that they would take advantage of what English the Japanese do know already, but would put emphasis on just those areas where Japanese specifically have problems. I don't think the answer is to go into a program which has 14 Spaniards and 10 South Americans and 5 Arabs and so on. They should have programs which are specifically geared toward the problem areas that they encounter. So it would be very much like the reverse of our Falcon program, where we take Americans who are studying specifically Japanese, and then they come over here and do advanced work.
So the kind of problems and difficulties Japanese learners of English encounter are substantially different in quality from those difficulties that maybe Arab learners of the language may encounter. That's what you mean, right?
Right. These difficulties are not only linguistic, they're sociolinguistic.
Right, right.